The video. Today we're going to talk about an overview of Agile requirements processes. This will be a high-level overview, and you can see the rest of the videos in this section to talk in more detail about how we go about doing that and the details of it. But I want to give you the context because this is one of the areas that being an Agile organization, or the pieces that facilitate agility, are significantly different than the traditional ways of doing things. So this is an important, very important section. So we'll take a look at the review of Agile requirements process. Key takeaways for you in this section. Want to show you how we are living out the Agile Manifesto values and principles. So these are the pieces that apply directly to the requirements development and analysis process. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So that's one of the Agile values in the Agile Manifesto. And the way we go about elaborating requirements prioritizes people over process, right? We know that people are going to be much more effective than a process that is structured and rigid. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. That one, maybe it's a little bit more of a stretch, but often in contract negotiation, there's a lot of requirements, elaboration. I want to make sure that everybody knows all the details of the requirements. Better to just have a well-written contract that allows for variability and flexibility so that we can elaborate those requirements later down the line. Another one of the principles of the Agile Manifesto is responding to change over following a plan. We want to be able to respond to those things that are happening late in development. It is more important in fast-moving contexts to be able to change than it is to just be able to follow a plan, right? Following a plan is easy. Adapting to the changing technologies and the changing requirements of your customers is much harder. Simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done. There's a great little quote or acronym that we use, and it's called YAGNI, Y-A-G-N-I. Write it down, Y-A-G-N-I. And it stands for you ain't gonna need it. So we want to take an approach to requirements analysis that says, let's assume that whatever you're looking at, there's a very good possibility that you aren't going to need it. So don't put too much detail or don't put too much effort in up front, because you might get down the line and go, you know what, we don't need that. And that would have been wasted effort. So you want to put in just enough, but not too much. And we'll talk about how some of the tools that we use to make that happen. And then the last one is probably the closest, and that is we welcome changing requirements even late in development. Agile organizations recognize that part of a core part of why we become Agile organizations is to allow for changes late in the game, because we know that they happen. So let's not make systems that fight against it, but that plan for it and make it central. All right, so we achieve all this by applying the lean principle just in time, or JIT. It was developed, it was one of the early developments in the lean systems development, and you can read about that in the other sections on lean. But this is what we do. We do just in time requirements elaboration, and I'll show you how we do that here in the next couple slides. All right. So just-in-time is a lean principle, and I got this off of the Investopedia definition of lean, of the just-in-time lean principle. It says an inventory just-in-time is an inventory strategy that companies employ to increase the efficiency and decrease waste by receiving goods only as they are needed in the production process, thereby reducing inventory costs. This method requires producers to forecast demand accurately. That's really good. And you need to be aware of all of the little pieces that are brought out in that. The idea of just-in-time is the real principle. The reason that it was created was to reduce inventory waste. And if you're familiar at all with manufacturing, which I assume most people are not, you understand that inventory has what they call a carrying cost, and carrying costs are huge in manufacturing. If you have a bunch of inventory laying around, it's waste. You want to minimize the amount of inventory that's hanging out, because all of those pieces of inventory are things that you aren't selling right now. And so if, for example, this is your worst case scenario that you're wanting to avoid, you have this big pile of doors for a car, and because you're processing them in huge batches, you have a lot of these doors, the inventory of them. But suddenly there's a change in the car model, and or there's, they find that there's a defect, and so there's a recall on your car to replace the doors. Well, crud, you've got 10,000 doors sitting here, and they're all out of spec. If you had not had them in your inventory process, then you would not have to throw them away, because what you're going to have to do with those doors is either retrofit them, or you're going to have to throw them away. And that's huge waste. Until there's these pockets of this carrying waste all around. And that's just one version of the waste. There's also the delay costs associated with it that we'll talk about when we talk about flow in another section. But the cost of the delay that you cause to the system by carrying big inventories is magnitudes greater than the cost if you just flow the pieces through on what we call a pull system. So here, I'll show you in this slide here what it looks like in the traditional sense. The blue boxes you see here in the top one, the top flow, are requirements. These are the things that are needed. And so the traditional approach says we're going to define all of it in scope. There's the scope statement. In the business case, we define what's in and out of scope. There they are. Those, 14 things. 16 things. And then you go, okay, well, I'm going to take all those things, I'm going to develop requirements for them. And so you move all of the scope into the requirements, and you do a couple of months of requirements gathering and analysis and in-depth study, and you work hard on this, and you're trying to figure it all out and get the requirements fleshed out, get them clean and clear and crisp, and detail everything you need from that requirement. Each one of those 16 requirements has to be elaborated all the way out, so that you can hand it to the architecture people, and they will then be able to understand what it is. They will take those requirements and architect a system that will hopefully be able to do what you want it to do. And then you'll take those architecture designs and send them off to the design group, who will skin it and figure out how are we, it takes the next level down from architecture to going into how is it actually going to be. Architecture is more how are the systems going to connect. Design is more about how's it going to look, how's it going to work. And then you hand it off to the build. So they have to finish all of the design work so that there's no questions, because the build people need to just be able to go, boom, we're going to build it all, right? So then you go to the build section, and they build. And then hopefully they move it on to test, and the test, and move a bunch of things back into build, because they had to fix some test problems. And then you move all of it back into the test, and you test. And then eventually you deploy. All right. Now, significant. So this is what we would call a large batch and queue push system, because this pile of things is a queue, right? It is things that all have to be worked through individually before we can pass it off to the next group. You may work in phases, but all that is would be taking a column of these and passing that large batch on to the next queue. So you batch queue, right? The opposite of that, or the agile approach to that, a more lean approach to that, would be to say, you know what? Here in the early times when you're doing the business case stuff, we are going to do something called story mapping, and we'll show you how to do that in one of the other modules here in the requirements section. But story mapping is a way of getting out a high level idea of what are all the pieces that are going to go into this. Not in detail, but what are the big pieces? And you write that down on a small card as essentially a reminder. And you ideally do this with the whole team that's going to be doing your building. So not just your people who do elaboration of requirements, which will often include your sponsors or business analysts and architects, as well as the designers, as well as the development team and the test team. I look at these two as one team, really. Actually, all three of these as one team. And you'd have all of them in this story mapping session. It's not long. I have done story mapping sessions that are hours, a couple of hours. I've done story mapping sessions that were 2-3 days. But it's not what the requirements elaboration process is, which is months. Right? I have done requirements elaboration processes that go 2-3 months before. And that's not what we're doing. High level, just a few notes on a card. That's a reminder so you can talk about it later. So then what we do is we want to take those stories, and in our first sprint, BTD means build, test, deploy. In your first test, you're going to elaborate. See how it's gotten bigger? The box, we took one from here and we moved it here. Yeah, see that? Burp, burp, moved right over there. And elaborated it out because we're doing it. We elaborated it out at the moment we needed to do it, not any time earlier. And then we do the next one. We pull it over, we elaborate it, we pull the next one in, we elaborate it, we pull the next one in, we elaborate it, we pull the next one in, we elaborate, pull, elaborate, pull, elaborate. All right, you see how that works. And the pile is going down over here on the left and building it all out on the right. So you can see that we have done it in a just-in-time elaboration approach so that we have the best information about the requirement when we're doing it. We'll see that in the next couple of slides here. This is what I'm talking about when I say just-in-time requirements elaboration. We don't elaborate the requirements before we need to work on them. Things will change. Your knowledge will change. The requirements will change. Your customers' needs will change. If you do it this way, you're able to respond to change even late in the game, right? All right. Here's another look at just-in-time requirements elaboration in comparison. Here's where we're doing the business case. We do requirements, architecture and design, build, integrate, test, deploy. Similar to what we looked at in the last section, not the last slide, but the last video sections in the introduction about the difference between a waterfall and an agile approach. Now, in an agile approach, we have 3 different times that we look at requirements that take up time, but we spread them out across the whole timeline instead of just doing them all up front. If you looked at it, it really winds up being similar amount of time investment, but it's done over the life cycle of the project in order to have better quality of answer. So if you look here, this first one is a little bit bigger because that's the story mapping. It takes a couple hours or a couple days, depending on how big the system is that you're designing. The one that was a couple of days was a very large system that took multiple years to implement, but we wanted to get the whole understanding of it was a migration of certain existing legacy systems that were integrated. Now we had to move them over to better, newer technologies that were more scalable and keep them integrated. So it was really kind of rebuilding but reimagining parts of this entire system. So we had to do this large story mapping. So that helped us understand how the pieces all fit together, and it actually builds community great. When we get to that part, we'll talk about that. The next one is what I call story time. I don't know if anybody else uses this term. I made it up for myself, but other people might use it because it's a pretty logical term. It's like when you're a little kid in kindergarten and they put the mats out and you go sit down on the mat and you get to hear about the story. It's a time when the product owner would come and elaborate, hey, these are the stories that are for the next sprint or the next 2 sprints. And let me tell you about them, so that when you get to sprint planning, which is the one that's here just at the intersection of each I just moved it out here so you could read it better. Each one of these sprint planning sessions is where you actually do okay, these are the stories we're going to do in this time period. This is the plan for doing them. Storytime gives you a preview of that, so that while you are working on the stories in this sprint, which you pulled it, so let's do this. Here's the story mapping time, and sprint 0 is kind of there's lots that happens in it, but you would have a story time here, story mapping here, story time here, that would say, hey, these are the sprints, these are the stories that I'm thinking, product owner saying, I'm thinking about having in the next sprint. So here's your information about them. Then the teams can ask questions, get clarification. The product owner has time to go answer those questions because they may not have the answers right away. And it gives them the opportunity to go get that. So then you get to sprint planning right here, and they understand much better what's going on. It shortens up the planning time, gives you just a couple hours of planning rather than, a full day or something like that. And then as you're delivering this week here, or this sprint here, halfway through it or something, you do another story time. Well, this story time, you're talking about what's going to go into this sprint. See how that works? So this story time is for the next sprint. This story time is for the next sprint. Or if you're really good, you'll get ahead. So you're talking about the next 2 sprints. So you've got a little bit of runway, and the people who are actually doing the development. Well, the great thing about doing the story time thing is the people who are actually doing the development are like, it's in the back of their mind, and it just kind of percolates, right? It's just there, and they know it's coming, and when you know it's coming, it's A, better because you're not surprised, and B, you're starting to think about, well, how would that work together? How could we make that? What's going to be the way to solve those problems? So once they get into it, they've actually already been thinking about it. So there you go. That's the agile approach. If you added all this up, like I said a minute ago, it's about the same amount of time as in this regular requirement session. It's just spread out to give you the just-in-time ability. See, because our insights into requirements improve over time pretty dramatically. I don't know if it's exponentially or geometrically, but it's probably neither of those. Our understanding improves over time because we're building the product, right? And the more we have the product built, the more we understand how it's actually going to work together. And if we're actually delivering these things to our customers, we're getting feedback from them, and we begin to understand their actual requirements significantly better, and can have more confidence in the requirements the further down the road you get. So your confidence level goes up, just like this curve goes up. Additionally, your risk of being wrong goes down, because here your risk of being wrong is quite high. It's just as high as the traditional waterfall approach. And here it's a little bit less. Here it's less and less. As you get closer to being done, it drops off precipitously, because your customers have been using the product and they know exactly what they're getting. So you see that decline in the risk of delivering the wrong thing. Another way of looking at your projects that is really important is, if this blurry box is a traditional requirements documentation, right? The traditional requirements documentation, everything is kind of a blur together. And I've experienced this many times, where you'll be working with the business analyst team or the product sponsors and talking about what's going to be developed. And everything in this block is of equal value. And there's really blurry lines where one feature starts and another feature stops, because it's all considered one thing. And when you look at that kind of a project, success is defined on whether you delivered all the scope or not. And there's no real accounting for what's important and what's not. You deliver it all, or you deliver none of it, or it's not. You missed scope. It's a failure, project failure, right? What we want to do in an agile project is decouple the systems, right? So we talked about having loosely coupled systems in an agile context. And we also want to think about the fact that some of these are actually the important features, right? These two blocks right here are the most important features. And so when we go, and the next most important features are these little gray ones right here, right? But in the previous version, everything's all mishmashed. So we don't know that. Here we know that these two are the most important, these two are the next important. So what would you do? Well, you would implement those two first, prioritizing by value. Implement the value first, and then you would implement the next set, the next most important features, and then you would implement the last set, and then the very, very last pieces, right? So instead of having all or nothing, you're able to say, we're delivering the most important things first, and then we deliver what's next important. And we could stop right there, and we've delivered the two most important groups of features to our customers. And we're getting feedback on those right away. They are the most important to our customers, so those are the most critical, that the quality and the accuracy as far as what our customers want and need is correct, right? So they're the things that you need to have most nailed down. And so if you get them out of the way first, you get the most time in your customer's hands to get feedback and to iterate on that. So again, this is another way of looking at the concept. If we were looking at this from the last section when we talked about the risks associated with agility, this is a way of mitigating that risk. Here, we're delivering the highest value features first, down to the lowest value features. And you know what? We might not deliver these features at the end at all. We have that choice here because we've decoupled the systems, and we know now that we're delivering the most important things first, then the next most important things, then the least important things. So we might get there to release 8 or 9 and go, we've been looking at it, and we have this other project over here that's going to have a X% ROI, which is way more than release 10, 11, and 12 will provide. The value that it will provide to our customers is so much more than those bottom features. We can drop those. You can't make that decision in a traditional waterfall model because everything is mishmashed together. And who knows, they may have built those things first because they were, quote, easier to build, but they weren't most important. And that's the key. So let's take a look at comparing the requirements process between a traditional and an agile organization. In the traditional model, they use use cases and detailed specifications. In an agile context, we use stories and acceptance tests. Those short stories about what do we need. In a traditional one, as early as possible, you want to lock it down, right? You want to lock down those requirements as soon as you can. In an agile context, you want to do it as late as reasonably possible. You saw that in the slide on the moving the requirements out there at the last reasonable moment. Now, you don't want to say at the very last minute, because that's maybe not the reasonable time to do that. You may need to reasonably have a couple weeks or a couple of months of requirements elaborated out. It depends on your risk and your context, what you actually need. That's why you work with someone who actually can help you analyze those things and look at, okay, strategically, where do we need to be planning? How do we need to be looking at these features? Focusing on completeness is what you do in your traditional one, right? We want to make sure we cover everything. In an agile one, we want to focus on understanding. Do I understand what we're trying to do? Not really concerned that it's all there. I want to understand the why and the purpose behind it. In traditional, they may actually be dictating the solutions in the requirements. And in in an agile context, we want to just keep it about the problem, because your ability to identify a good solution it increases over time. So you don't want to dictate those solutions up front. Traditional one obviously focuses on requirements. An agile approach looks at functionality. What are we trying to accomplish, right? What is the outcome we're trying to achieve? Not so much the requirements to make it happen, but what is the outcome that we're trying to get to? In a traditional model, we are specific and inflexible. We control change, as opposed to an agile context where we're open, negotiable, and flexible. We welcome changes even late in the game. The focus in a traditional model is delivery. We expect delivery of everything. And in an agile context, we expect to discover things along the way. We expect that at the beginning of this project, we don't know what we don't know. There are unknowns and unknown unknowns. So we want to acknowledge that and make our systems allow for that, account for that, be optimized for that. In a traditional model, you want to get all of the scope. And as I talked about here earlier, in the agile model, it's value-based. We want to deliver the most important value first. All right, so our key takeaways, we talked about focusing on the Agile Manifesto and principles, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Right? We want to focus on the fact that people doing knowledge work are the most important factor, more impactful than processes and tools. Not that processes and tools are not important, they're still good, but the emphasis is on the individuals. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. We want to collaborate as much as we can. Responding to change over following a plan. Probably the biggest one for this section. Maximizing the amount of work not done. If I were to elaborate those requirements in early on, like I do in a traditional approach, and something changes then, I have to go back and change those requirements. That's not maximizing the amount of work not done, right? I may even get farther down in the project and realize I don't need a feature X, Y, or Z because of the way we implemented features A, B, and C. So simplicity and waiting till the last reasonable moment allows you to maximize the work not done. And then, of course, we welcome changing requirements, even late in the development. And we achieve all this, like I said earlier, by using the just-in-time model for looking at your agile requirements. All right, that's it for this video. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks. Bye-bye.